You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The conversation you're about to join was inspired by our Spring Mixtape 2025 non-series sermon series. Rather than a series, this will be a collection of sermons based on what God is leading us to preach on this spring. You can find out more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
So this was your last one-off sermon for a while. How late in the week did you get the basis or the foundation for this week's sermon?
I think it was late Wednesday afternoon. It might have been Thursday morning.
I'm going to vote Thursday morning. And how did that come about?
I took some time on Wednesday because I was feeling stressed that I didn't have a sermon kind of in process. Took some time to really just pray about it, think about it, flipped through the Bible a little bit just to see. Looked at some things that I had been thinking about again that hadn't really come together earlier in the week, and still didn't feel like they were the right thing. And so I went to the lectionary readings for the week, which, if people don't know what the lectionary is, it's a 3-year cycle that kind of makes sure that churches that use it are kind of hitting all the major points in Scripture over a 3-year period. And some pastors always preach from one of the lectionary passages. There's always an Old Testament reading, a gospel reading, a reading from the epistles, and a psalm that are a part of that. And so there are some pastors who just take that as their preaching text each week. And so when I looked at that, the Acts 11 passage about Peter reporting his experience with Cornelius and the Spirit was in there, and that kind of got things rolling. I forget, somewhere in there the idea of change came up, and that's how we got there.
So you open up talking about health and trying to shed, 100 pounds.
Whoa.
And picking, I think the phrase was similar to, correct me, choosing which hard path?
Yeah.
Or choosing which hard option. As in, like, you can suffer all the consequences of not exercising and dieting and all of those kinds of things, or you can choose to eat broccoli.
Right.
And for whole foods and be intentional about taking care of your diet and not having all of the ice cream that your heart desires.
Or even half of it.
So what's the most ice cream you've eaten in one sitting?
I don't know. I'm not like a big sit down all at once. I like a little bit, but I like to eat it frequently.
Like throughout the day? Like you just...
No. Just
nightcap?
Yeah. There are worse vices.
Yeah. Good for you. We're very on different spectrums. I'm like 99% sure at some point, if not multiple points in college, I just ate an entire half gallon.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, but I've grown.
Yeah.
I've grown.
Me too. That's the problem.
Yeah, more outward than up. But what are other areas in which we have two options, essentially? We can go kind of the passive, which has hard consequences, or we have the hard intentionality that saves us from the poor consequences. What are some areas in which we can, as you discussed with all of the various stories, kind of like team up with Jesus or partner or follow his leading in? Yeah, what are some other areas besides physical health?
I think most of the practices of the Christian faith can fall into those either or kind of categories. Like, take Sabbath, for instance. I'm a better husband, pastor, father when I am practicing Sabbath, when I do what God has already told me to do and set aside a day to rest, to enjoy Him, to do things that fill me with delight with God. And so, but to do that, I have to choose the hard of blocking out that time, right? I have to protect that time. I have to prepare for that time if it's going to be as meaningful as it could be. And just a lot of scheduling stuff, it falls into that category. I could say yes to every opportunity that comes up during a week, but then I'm going to suffer from the reality of being over busy and not having enough margin in my life for God to really speak to me. I'll just be running from one thing to the next. And I'll be exhausted.
Yeah, I like the one quote, someone wise, I'm sure, that said if you're too busy for God, you're busier than God intended you to be.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes we have all the excuses, especially in not just American culture, but Northeastern culture of like
Mhm.
busy is better. It is a sign of productivity. It's a sign of,
Yeah, it's a badge of honor, right?
you know,
Yeah, so that's one. I think, how we spend our money could easily be another one where, you can choose to put away some money, have a little bit of savings so you can have some buffer room in case of an emergency. But that means you have to say no to some of the things you want to do in any given moment or day to make that happen.
yeah,
Or,
the number in the account, and then the thing you want is under that number. So why not get the thing that you want?
sure, I mean, that is an option, but then, somebody backs into your car and you have to have it repaired in order to be able to get to work the next day. And so,
I bet your car one time, Scott. It kind of even connects back to what I was preaching on a couple weeks ago of like we kind of shove God and God time and all that kind of stuff into the church, which makes it easy to like compartmentalize it. We can put all of these other areas of our life away from being affected by our faith or from God and His will for us. What's an area that you struggle like? Maybe the one that you were most resistant, even if you weren't aware of your resistance, of like giving up to God in your lifetime.
all of them. By nature, I really don't like people telling me what to do.
Mm.
And so I think you could define my spiritual journey as one of coming to various points of surrender and giving up whatever might be the issue at that time. That's been the journey the whole way, whether it's what I was gonna do with my life, or if I was going to actually lean into those things that God has already told us. So that was a little bit when I talked a few weeks ago about the year that rest was my word, and that passage from Jeremiah about standing at the crossroads and asking for the ancient paths,
Yeah.
and if you walk in them, you'll find rest. That year was kind of a deeper invitation to lay aside my preferences and my kind of natural rhythms,
Mhm.
that kind of stuff, to do the things that I know God has already told me to do so that he could do what he wants to do in me. What about for you? Has there been like one of those things, or has it been more like, wow, you're probably better than me though. You probably haven't had to wrestle with it so much.
That's true. I'm in 100% agreement with that statement. Oh, getting called from the wife. Back to me being better than you. The more recent one that comes to mind, I guess, like finances.
Yeah.
Uh, I feel like you tithe, you give a little extra, bam, that's all that's being asked of you.
Hmm.
If all of me is supposed to be God's and He's provided all of the ways in which I've been able to make money, then why shouldn't all of it be at His disposal?
Mhm.
And so I feel like COVID-ish, somewhere in COVID era, there was a time where just like the algorithm was getting me
Hmm.
every single night as I was trying to get to sleep. I was just like, oh, this is 50 to 90% off.
Yeah.
It's like you eventually wise up that they're always 50% to 90%. That you're not saving as much money as you think you're saving. But so I got in those kinds of bad habits. And our young adults at one point did a Lent challenge where you couldn't make any purchases besides, I think it's grocery and gas. Those are like new purchases.
Yeah.
You could, pay for medical things, obviously. You could pay for continuing subscriptions and utilities and
Yeah,
like
like your bills.
your bills and all that kind of stuff. But groceries and gas were the only new things you could get. And so that means like before Lent, you prepped for like toiletries and
Mm.
whatever else, cleaning supplies, whatever else you need in the house for that time. And then it's no purchasing. And so you're able to learn not only the self control, but as temptations and things come up after those days, you realize like, oh, I didn't really need it. It was more of just like
Yeah.
a jump the gun purchase. And so it made you a little more thoughtful about what you were buying. I hope it's still kind of a journey, like, all these things are, but trying to get to a place where like each purchase is with God in consideration
Yeah.
because he provides our needs and blesses us with more. And so making sure that we're being good stewards with what he's given us.
Hmm.
But that one's been a
Yeah.
tougher one.
And
Yeah.
that's part of the discipline of fasting, right? Is that we're learning to tell our body no. We're learning to tell our desires no. So that way we're not just constantly making decisions based on what we want in
Mhm.
any given moment. That's a part of it. And I think what you were talking about there with finances, that's kind of the shift we see from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Old Testament, you kind of get that focus on here's what the expectation is, here's the 10%. This is what it means to tithe. But then Jesus comes in and he says, really God owns it all. And it's more about your heart than about the actual 10%, right? If he's given it all, then he should get a say in it all.
Yeah. And I think with all of these areas, one of the questions that you posed that I think warrants deeper reflection from those that are listening and listened on Sunday is the do you want to be well?
Mm,
Because I think there's a lot at play there that we probably don't even have time in this podcast to get into, depending on people's views of themselves, views of God, histories and relationships with different areas of wellness. I think that question is very profound. And it's one of those things where if you're talking like eating better and physical stuff, like it takes a long time to see the results
hmm.
of that hard work. And I think same thing as we've been doing practicing the way course, or we did practicing the way course, is that it's doing the practices we see Jesus doing for a long time to see the fruit of how it transforms us and not to have what was the quote you always did, like it's not the practices aren't the means to an end or ends
No,
to an
they're not the end. They're the means to the end. The end is becoming like Jesus. It's learning to love like Jesus. Yeah.
yeah, the ultimate goal isn't doing the things but the fruit of what they will bring. And I also, as you talked about, Naaman went in the Jordan River, and that was viewed as something below what someone of his position would
Yep.
do. What is something in ministry you've done that maybe others would view as beneath a pastor?
And it has been kind of a philosophy of ministry kind of thing where I don't ever want to ask someone to do something that I'm not willing to do myself, at least in some form or function. But to think about the other day, just a few weeks ago, we had finished up our service. We had had communion that day, and there were some breadcrumbs in the sanctuary where our servers were standing as they were handing out the pieces of bread. And I ran and grabbed the vacuum and was vacuuming up the breadcrumbs, and some people from Lamb of God were coming in as they were getting ready for their service. So, oh, Pastor, you shouldn't be doing that. I was like, if Jesus can wash feet, I can vacuum up communion crumbs. So that was just, one of those easy ones. I'm not somebody so special that there's nothing I shouldn't be willing to do.
Yeah. And I think that's tough within ministry, since you touched on like Jesus washing the feet and come to serve and not be served. The balancing of leading with that mindset. And then also, I think of like early church where they had to find like the seven to help like feed and take care of people.
Sure.
Like, you have a place and position to do certain things, and God has provided and equipped other people within the body to do other areas. So it's not that you have to do all of the things, but like you said, be willing to do all of the things with a servant's heart.
Yeah, and so for me, the struggle is, I have to recognize that as pastor in the role that I fill within our congregation, like it's not always the best use of my time to do all those things, right? And so I have had to learn, and I am still learning to let go of some of that stuff that other people can do for the sake of doing what God has called me to do. And it seems it seems counterintuitive, but there's a sense of pride that I've had to lay down
Mhm.
in letting other people do those things and not, like, it seems like it's a very humble thing to say, oh, no, 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 I can do these things. I can vacuum up breadcrumbs. I can fold bulletins. I can whatever. But at some point, there can be an inversion there, and that actually becomes a prideful thing. And so learning to let other people do what they can do so that I can do what I can do, and we can all fulfill what God is calling us to do.
Yeah, and it's good for the health of the church, I think, for others to be able to know it and not all rely on Scott.
Hmm.
Because I remember when you left Trinity to come to Collingswood every single day, literally every single day, like, oh, that was a Scott thing. Can someone call Scott or text Scott? Like Scott knows that. Scott knows that. Oh, Scott knows how to do that. Scott knows the person for this or that. Like, you just, and it wasn't that you used or abused your position. That's what you were supposed to do within
I
the
was
position.
say part of that was my associate role, right?
Absolutely. So that was like your role to do. But the church solely depended on you to do that and didn't have an expectation for anyone else to know, or yeah, it just wasn't set up well for anyone else to know. And it was like things that some of those things weren't even things that should have been in your role. You just took them upon yourself to help within the body. And so getting all the random calls, and we missed you, so we just found so I was just thinking of like the statistic of like 20 to 30%, and it might be less than that, of like church members do all of the work.
Yeah. Yeah, the
From
statistic that gets thrown around is 20% of the people do 80% of the work.
Yeah, it's like between committees and tech and like you'll see that same kind of hub of people. And so when we get to like nomination time in the year for nominating people for different committees and stuff like that, it usually just ends up becoming the same people because usually they're the willing ones and they're
Right.
more familiar or whatever it may be. And so but we want everyone to have a voice within
Mhm.
the body, but also, different people have different giftings, and we want to be able to utilize it so that people don't burn out doing a bunch of stuff just so that the stuff can get done, but be able to work together as a body to accomplish what God is desiring for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're 100% right.
Thank you for joining us for this week's podcast.
We need everybody. That's the moral of the story.
I don't know if you said this or if I. This question says, "What do you want Jesus to do?"
Or I said, what do we want Jesus to do for us? And then I said, more specifically, what do you want Jesus to do for you? Like, kind of asking people to consider, like, what change do they see needs to be made in their life that they might not have the power to do?
As a Francis Chan fan stan, there was a quote from the book Crazy Love, Overwhelmed by a Relentless God. He says, "But God doesn't call us to be comfortable. He calls us to trust Him so completely that we are unafraid to put ourselves in situations where we will be in trouble if He doesn't come through."
Mm.
And for me, it's just a depth of faith and trust that He is faithful, and that if He's calling us to things, that He will show up and be faithful to us. What did that make you think of? You pulled up something.
Yeah, as you started talking, it shifted a little bit as you went on. But just the idea that, like, in preaching, we're called to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. God is always working in our lives. And when we settle into a complacency with where we are, then, can he still move? Yes. Does he do things to get our attention? For sure. But so many times he'll let us just kind of sit there and languish in that complacency rather than continue to grow. And sometimes we need to be challenged in that.
So, what would your challenge for the listeners this week be?
I think it's pretty similar to what I said in the sermon, and it's the idea that God is working in somewhere in your life. He wants to be, whether we're listening for it, looking for it, or not. He is working. There are things he wants to change in us. And would you take time to let him identify that for you? And then would you be willing to do whatever you need to do to cooperate with that grace he's working in your life, right? Because that's really what grace is. We talk about grace a lot as like an unmerited gift of, it's God's favor towards us. But essentially, grace is God's active work in our lives. And so, where is he working? Where is he pouring out that grace? And will you do what you need to do so that he can do what only he can do?
Well, that's our conversation for today. But that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.